Well, yeah, I wish I could present So let's look up live.
I know where you're going to put the gift. You're taking it. I can close it if you.
Okay. Okay. Okay, so just want to double check. You're doing the housing policy?
Yes,
Okay. So
Not-
the sign is a little different there.
it's not Habitat for Humanity.
Okay. Okay, I was just clearing things up. Sorry, the signs were not updated outside, but we're good. So we have Scott Fleming here, and he's going over the housing policy creation. And I'll let Scott take over. Go ahead.
Oh, thank you. My name is Scott Clement. I'm from Wacomakong on Manitoulin Island. So I everyone and glad to be here today. I presented last year. I've come here a number of years and I've done different types of presentations. Some of you probably know me for the personal finance workshops, which are very popular in some of the communities I do. That's where I get people into home ownership. I'm so happy I followed the code compliance guy because a lot of the stuff he was talking about on longevity is something I touch on the housing policy. And I always tell First Nations when I start developing a housing policy, and a lot of people have a misconception about housing policy. They think a housing policy is there to evict tenants, right? And that's what a lot of First Nation clients think. But what it's actually there for is to make the houses last longer, believe it or not. If you implement a housing policy consistently, your houses should last 35, 40, 45 years. Now, the great thing about following that young fellow that did his presentation, he was talking about longevity of the building after it's been built. And that's where the housing policy kicks in. So one of the things I always do, I do a lot of strategic planning with First Nations, especially around maintenance issues. And one of the big things we like to do is educating members on their responsibilities. How many people just sign the lease and hand the keys over to the tenant? Raise your hand. Oh, two or three? Well, that's what was happening in the past. They would say, here's the lease agreement. You got to pay $450 a month, come to the band office. And they were never taught anything on their maintenance responsibility. It might have been, glossed upon when they were going over the lease agreement, but we have to start teaching some maintenance responsibilities to the tenant. You know why? They're living in a building every day, and it's a small stuff that they can do every day that's going to make the house last longer. Now, that young fella talked about longevity. He's seen the downspout with no elbows. You know what? I see that a lot in a lot of communities. And he said it's a $3 fix. And then that basement was flooded, and now you got $1,000 damage. The one I like talking about is the bathroom sink. What happens to the bathroom sink when you don't fix it? It leaks for 5 years. What happens? Well, the water goes behind the vanity to the floor. It was a 10 cents job to fix, but now it's 8,000. You got to get a new vanity, new subfloor, mold. All of that was preventable. So we got to teach our tenants not only how to fix the homes, but when to call us. And the other big piece, and probably the most important part of a housing policy, I don't think it's rent collection, believe it or not. It's annual inspections. How many people do annual inspections of their units? Raise your hands. Okay, I hope next year if I do this, more hands next year. Because if you do annual inspections, you know what's going to happen? Your maintenance costs are going to drop because you're fixing these minor repairs. And he said it great. He said, fix these minor repairs before they turn into major repairs. So that's what a housing policy does. It's not necessarily there to collect rent and evict, but as long as you're inspecting your unit, it's going to be maintained and you're going to fix these little problems. The other thing, I review a lot of housing policies, and one of the worst clauses I hate is if you don't pay rent, we're not fixing your unit. That is one of the worst things you can do. Who owns the house? Who owns that rental unit? Yeah, the van. You got to fix that regardless of if that person's paying rent, because at the end of the day, you're the landlord, so you're responsible. So today we're going to talk about housing policy and how to develop one. How many people have an up-to-date housing policy now that they're enforcing? Okay. Now I work with a lot of clients from across Canada. Some of them collect rent, some of them don't. Some of them evict, some of them don't. A lot of them though, there's a lot of deferred maintenance. And then we always have housing meetings. You know, the worst thing that comes to mind is all the tenants are complaining lack of maintenance. So a housing policy, if you want to start the poll, it's me. Okay, so the housing policy, really, what it does, it allows the housing chief and council housing committee to deliver housing in an unbiased, transparent way. So unbiased, you know, one of the things I promote is anonymous scoring. Has anybody ever heard of that? Anonymous scoring? Yeah. So how do you do it in your community? You know? Blind scoring. So who gets to see the names of the tenants? Just myself and then housing committee decides. And what does the housing committee see? They see the application with black names and that number, like that. Yeah, I do this in a lot of communities. You know why? It's especially small communities. What happens in small communities? We're all what? Yeah, we're all related. That's my cousin. So what happens is you got to declare a conflict of interest, and soon, and in no time, you have no housing committee because they're all in conflict of interest. So this is what anonymous scoring does. It allows you to score people without you declaring conflict of interest. Your brother or sister can apply. You don't have to declare conflict of interest because you don't know who you're looking at. Now, what I suggest is that you don't even give them the application. You should just give them a spreadsheet with a random number and their score, and that's how you allocate housing. And the only time names are revealed is when the final selection. So what's great about that is that, you know, there's no personal bias. I've been to a lot of housing committee meetings where people bring up the past. Well, this guy beat me up in grade 8, right? I'm not going to give him no housing. The other thing is we got to educate our members. Now, the great thing about following that young fellow's presentation, he talked about winter in Northern Ontario, Quebec. One of the big things about energy efficiency, there's a trade-off that he didn't talk about. Today's house building code is so strict, our houses are super airtight because we want to conserve on energy, we want to have low hydro bills. But the trade-off is a HRV. How many people are familiar with a HRV in Ontario? Yeah. And you know what? When I worked at CMHC for about 12 years, we did inspections, and a lot of places I went, guess what happens? It's unplugged. Or there's a pillow into the intake. So what happens if you turn that off? You know what you're going to get? You're going to get mold. These houses are so airtight, you don't even have to go in somebody's house to see if the HRV's on. You know why? If you're cooking a pot of spaghetti, what happens to all the windows in the whole house? They get all foggy and misty. So you're letting all this moist air. And the other thing too, is if you're taking showers, there's no place for that moisture to go. So that's why we got to educate members. So I work with a Manitoba band. You know what they make their tenant do? They make them watch a video on what the HRV does so that they understand what a HRV is. How many people do a move-in inspection? Or how many people know what a move-in inspection is? Yeah, this is where the tenant moves in and you go with the tenant and you do a condition report. And you know what, here, this is where you should do a mini maintenance workshop. This is how you change the stove element. This is how you reset the breaker. This is how you plunge your toilet. Did you know people don't know how to change a stove element? How many, did you know that? There's a lot of people that don't know how to do that. So you got to show them that. The other thing that really is my pet peeve is what happens when you hang blankets on windows? That's the worst thing you can do. When I worked at CMHC, we'd have a grand opening in the community. Later that evening, I walk around the village and what do you see on the windows? Blankets, no curtains, no blinds. So what happens when you hang blankets? You know, you get moisture all around the window. And what happens is it starts to mold. It's totally preventable. And I always tell people, you know what really makes me mad is when I see a Montreal Canadian blanket, you know? Kick that guy out. Toronto Maple Leaf blanket, not a problem. So on your building, when you're building a house, I always tell bands, you should probably throw in the first set of blinds or curtains. You know why? You can tell the tenant, you know, these blinds and curtains are on us. If they break, you're responsible for replacing them, but do not hang blankets. And if you're going to hang a blanket, you need a space between the window and the door. I mean, the window and the blanket so that there's air circulation. The other one is hoarding. How many people have tenants that hoard? That's another problem. That impedes the flow of air in the house and which leads to mold. Again, a lot of this is preventable. So I always tell people, you got to start educating members on their responsibilities. So part of the strategic planning on housing, I help band members train tenants on their maintenance responsibilities, when to call housing, especially if it's water related. We need to know right away. I've heard some stories where tenants don't call in when it's too late, maybe 5 years later. I had one client where the washer wasn't installed properly. So the water leaked behind the washer and underneath the washer, and they only mopped the visible water. They never called housing. So fast forward 5 years later, the water, this is a house slab on grade, the water went underneath the toilet, underneath the tub, rotted out the bathroom, $55,000 damage. So the band asked me, whose fault is that? I said, well, it's both your fault. It's the tenant's fault for not telling you, you know, that he was a water leak. And it's your fault. You should have been doing annual inspections in the first place. If they didn't tell you the first year, the mold would have been limited to the laundry room, but now it's right underneath. Thank God CMHC had CAP funding, and that's how they got that paid for. So it's very fortunate. So we're going to talk a little bit. Now I'm going to go through some examples of what you can put. Now, like I said, I work with different communities. So these are, you know, not necessarily might not work in your community. Like I said, I have a lot of northern communities. You can't evict in a flying community. There's no place to go. And if you evict in northern community, what happens? They're just going to move down the road where there's a house. Somebody said they've been to a house with 17 people. Well, now you're going to have 30 people because you just evicted it. So we have to come up with different ways to look at this. So we want to develop a proper maintenance plan to ensure minimal level of health and safety. And I'm going back, annual inspections. One of the key parts of a housing policy, I think the cornerstone, is doing annual inspection. And believe it or not, and I know I got some inspector friends here, you do not need to be an inspector to do a house inspection. You know, if you see curling shingles on a roof, what does that tell you? Change the roof, right? We're not going to wait for it to leak. We're going to change it right away. The other thing too is you can fix stuff before it breaks. For example, that curling shingles, it may not be leaking, but we're not going to wait for it to leak. So the other thing we want to do, we want to extend the useful life of our existing housing stock. You know, when I started in CMHC back in 99, 2000, there was a study that said the average on reserve house was lasting 14 or 15 years. How long are our mortgages on these CMHC houses? Yeah, a 10-year gap. And a lot of it has to do, I know a lot of it was shoddy construction, obviously, but some of it too, we didn't train our band members how to take care of the house. So a key component is actually training your housing member tenants. And the other thing we want to do is promote home ownership. There's a couple of home ownership programs to do, First Nations Market Housing Fund, but I also do rent to own. Anybody do rent to own here? Yeah, it's a great program. You could do rent to home under CMHC Section 95. The great thing I like about rent to own is that, you know, there's pride of ownership. You know, if people know they're gonna own that house, they're not gonna bust the windows, they're gonna take care of the lawn, right? You know, they're not gonna bust holes in the drywall. So unfortunately though, I do see people do that even on rent to own. So what a lot of bands I'm doing now is on rent to own, what we're doing is we're doing the first 3 years as a rental. And every year we're gonna inspect your house. At the end of 3 years, if you're not in arrears, you're taking your house, we convert it into rent to own for the remaining 22 years. However, if you're in arrears and you're not taking care of the house, guess what? You have to step aside and we're going to put someone else in there that deserves rental. So that's how we're getting around that. So rent to own you can do through CMHC. We do quite a bit of that across Canada. When I was at CMHC, I kind of really advocated for that because I know, you know, that's another form of home ownership. A lot of bands I work with, there's no bank financing available, right? CMHC or BC Housing now is the only game in town in some of these communities. So we can't really access bank financing. So we talk about home ownership. So some of the elements of a housing policy: governance, rental own, renovations, appeals. So governance, I look at housing committee. I'm having so much fun with housing committees lately. A lot of them, the first thing I always talk about housing committee is you do not have direct day-to-day responsibilities, but I have a lot of housing committees doing everything, directing staff, you know, trying to fire staff, hire staff. That's not your job. So a lot of times I actually train housing committees on what their responsibilities are. They have to go back to their terms. How many people have a housing committee with a good terms of reference? You guys know what you gotta focus that terms of reference on exactly what they do. And then, you know what I tell them to do? Take your terms of reference, take your agenda and compare it. And if there's something on the agenda that's not on terms of reference, guess what? That's not your responsibility, right? So that's how I train housing committees, know their responsibilities. One of the biggest responsibilities of a housing committee is actually to what? Review the housing policy every year. You know, maybe our default policy is too strict. Maybe there's new laws, right? The other thing too is we can select tenants based on scoring. A lot of them are involved with that. Some of them are involved with the evictions, okay? Some housing managers in some communities, they do not want to evict without the housing committee's support. You know why? They don't want to face the community backlash. So they say, well, it's not me, it's the housing committee that kicked you out, right? I'm not the bad guy here. So that's why a lot of them. The other thing we want to do is provide advice to the housing department. It's advice, not direction. They kind of confuse that word as well. So you want to make sure that the chief and council is informed on all matters related to housing. The other thing too is a lot of them have council reps on there or ex officios. There's always confusion on their roles about ex officio, so they follow Robert's terms of rules. So I do a lot of training with housing committees and then giving them overview on housing. A lot of them don't understand some of the programs, so I give them an overview of all the CMHC programs or any program that's available on reserve. We do the training on. Okay, so the other thing, housing department responsible day-to-day, present budgets. So that's this is stuff I put in the governance section of a housing policy. Again, I'm not going to go through the whole job description part. And then the chairperson, again, maintain order, call for business. Now it's up to the chairperson to control the meeting. A lot of them wander off topic, and then what's supposed to be a 1 hour meeting turns into a three hour meeting. It's because the chairperson really has to keep people on topic. Again, call for recommendations on business and all of that. That's in there. What about the band member or tenant? Wouldn't it be nice if they paid rent regularly and on time, right? Again, that goes back to educating. When you're doing the lease agreement, you got to tell them it's due on the 1st of the month, not the 2nd, not the 15th, not the 23rd, it's due on the 1st of the month. Again, keep the home in good condition, clean and free of clutter. Again, going back to hoarding. So when you go into do annual inspection, so that's what we're looking for, these type of issues, hoarding or willful damage. That's the other thing. A lot of clients I work with now, they pay for willful damage. Well, that's not good. If I kick down my door, should my band pay for that? No, the tenant should pay for that. And if you can't afford to pay it, guess what? We're going to add $100 rent to your rent for 6 months, and then you're going to pay off that door. So we got to transfer some of this responsibility. Again, not sublet or assigned band-owned units. Again, pay all utilities and not do any alterations. This is another big problem. We have tenants who put bedrooms in the basement. What happens when there's no window? Yeah, it's a fire hazard. The other one, we went and did inspections. The tenant took out a load-bearing wall. and the band had to evacuate, or they were putting bedrooms in the basement and they cut the floor joists. We were wondering why the hallway was so springy walking down, eh? So these are things you want to prevent. And the alterations, you gotta, if you want to do now, when I do a policy on rent to own, I encourage alterations. You know why? I think if a band member wants to renovate it at their own cost, I also stipulate that you're not going to get reimbursed. But if you start fixing your own house as a rent to own, like you put in hardwood floors, what are the chances of them defaulting now? Because they got skin in the game. They got an investment. The other one too, I've seen bands let people put up garages. So you know what? You put up a man cave, there is no way that guy's leaving that house, right? So he's going to pay his rent. Again, the other one too is respect the rights and privacy of neighbors. Now, how many have a cannabis policy? Anybody have a cannabis? Okay. Now, a cannabis policy, we can ban, did you know you can ban cultivation of cannabis in a band rental without violating anybody's rights? And you can do that because growing marijuana requires a lot of hydration, which leads to mold. So it's a health and safety issue. You can also ban smoking tobacco and by extension, marijuana. So you can ban it without violating anybody's rights on their health and safety. And if you don't have that, you can also respect, there's a clause in many lease agreements. It's called, the tenant has to guarantee quiet enjoyment of the unit. So if my neighbor is smoking marijuana, I don't care how thick these walls are. Guess what? I'm going to smell marijuana in my side of the building. So if a tenant complains that they smell marijuana and it's bothering them, you have to do something with that tenant that's smoking marijuana. You got to tell them you can't do that because you guaranteed quiet enjoyment. So that's the other thing. Again, not cultivate or smoke cannabis. Again, content insurance. Usually most bands that I work with, they just do fire and structure. There's the odd band that'll pay content insurance up to $25,000, but that's up to you. I don't know how hard it is to get tenant related to insurance, especially if you're in a flying community, okay? And then housing application, members who are 18 years of age or older. Now, in Ontario, there's something called human rights. And there's, age discrimination against elders, but it's also towards the young people. So on a housing application, we have to say that you have to be 18 years of age with the exception of 16 or 17-year-olds who have withdrawn from parental control. And how does someone demonstrate they've withdrawn from parental control? There's one department at the band office that does that for you. It's called Ontario Works. So if that tenant, if that individual, 16 or 17-year-old is in receipt of Ontario Works, for people that don't know what Ontario Works is, it's welfare. If you're in receipt of welfare, that means you've withdrawn from parental control and we can accept your housing application. That doesn't mean we're going to give you a house. It just means we have to accept your housing application. So we have to put that. The other thing is affordability. We have to make sure. I have a lot of bands. They say, oh, he's on welfare. He can afford it. That's not true. It's based on how big your family is. So we do affordability rule. So for working tenants, we take their gross monthly income. You might want to write this formula down. Gross monthly income divided by monthly rent. And if it's greater or equal to 3.0, guess what? They can afford that house because they're spending less than 1/3 of their income on housing. So in theory, they should be able to afford. A lot of bands, they have that big budget application. Send us your bills so we can see that you can afford that house. Well, I worked at a band office. Ain't nobody going to send their bills in. And if they are, they're going to put one credit card, but I might have 4 credit cards. They'll put one car payment, but I might have 2. If you tell me I have to show I can afford that house, by God, I'm going to afford it. So that's why you look at these ratios. Now for welfare, you know what you do? You take shelter allowance has to be approximately the monthly rent, and this is where it gets tricky, plus the estimated utilities to heat and hydro for that house. And that's the uncertainty. So for example, if the rent is 500, sometimes we'll say, okay, I think utilities are going to be 200. So we need somebody who's getting a shelter allowance of at least 700 that can afford that house. And if somebody's only getting a shelter allowance of 500 and the rent is 500, you know what? They can't afford that house. You know why? Where are they going to get money for utilities? You have to pay utilities. So that's what you have to consider. Again, only band members are eligible for rent to own. And rent to own cannot be on Ontario Works or welfare at the time of application for rent to own. Okay, so the reason we disqualified them on rent to own is because there's that expectation that they can afford this house when the mortgage is paid off. If you're on welfare, they don't give you money for insurance, windows, doors. You got to be able to afford that yourself. But if somebody goes on welfare 10 years from now, nothing we can do. We got to honor the agreement. We just hope he's not on welfare long-term. Hopefully not, okay? So that's how we handle that. Oh, so. And then we look at tenancy agreement. A lot of things we're doing. We're strengthening the renewal. I'm encouraging bands to do yearly leases. Now, you don't have to print the whole 30-page lease. Just print the signature section because you're not changing any terms. You're just changing the term April 1st to March. And we say only tenants not in arrears can sign a new lease agreement. Those tenants on arrears March 31st, they're evicted without notice. The exception here, though, we always give them a doorway out, is you have to sign a rental arrears recovery agreement before March 31st, though, not April 1st. So a lot of places we put this in. The chief and counsel says, Scott, we're going to have a mass eviction March 31st. Never happened. You got to tell people, though, this clause is in there. And when I do community meetings, I always stop here and I ask band members if they're okay with this. And 90% of them don't have a problem with this. They say, pay your bills on time, right? Again, transferring, I know CMHC doesn't like this. I used to work at it, but transferring is really subletting. And a lot of communities say, Scott, it's happening. Let's put it in a policy. So we did. So what we said is, it has to be, we look at the criteria, health related, maybe I need long-term hospitalization. Education, I'm going back to university, 4 years, or employment. Now, we let you pick who's going in there. So it has to be a band member. And guess what? You're responsible for that band member. If you pick your brother Joe, who's a party animal, going to destroy your house, not pay rent, guess what? We're going to hold you responsible. You're responsible for all the arrears, all the damage that Joe does. Put your Aunt Mary in there who goes to bingo and church every Sunday and pays her bills. So that's kind of how we handle transfer. And by the way, if you don't come back, it's considered abandoned house. So that band member that's in there doesn't have any rights to that house. It goes back to the band, gets reallocated. Okay, so you got to come back. Okay, and this is a once in a lifetime thing. This isn't, I'll do 4 years university, stay a year, then go back out. No, this is kind of a once in a lifetime deal. So you're only allowed to do this once. Okay, so that's how we put that in there. Again, we look at criteria. Applicants must match occupancy to home there. So what does that mean? So if it's a 2-bedroom house, we're not going to score a family of 8. We're not going to put a family of 8 in there. That's overcrowding. On the other extreme, if it's a 4-bedroom house, we're not going to put a single person in there or a family with 1 child. That's called overhousing. That means there's more bedrooms than people. That's a waste of housing. So you got to match the house that you're going to. And then we always look at national occupancy standards. You guys are all familiar with that. If you're familiar with RAP, you're familiar with that term. Okay. Again, we look at scoring. So we look at current living conditions. So we score you on that. Am I in a homeless shelter, temporary housing? And we also look at if you're 35 years and still living at home, we consider that temporary housing. You're not expected to live there till you're 50. So a lot of times people live with their parents because there's no other housing. A lot of places, I have kids that are making 100,000 in some of the communities, but they're still living with mom and dad because there's no place to live. So that's why we call that temporary housing as well. So we look at substandard housing, overcrowding. Usually if you're an existing tenant, you're not eligible because you have a house. But if you can prove that you're in overcrowding, then we'll look at your application. So we look at, now a lot of band members miss that. Current living conditions, say substandard housing. We don't accept pictures either, because I can go on Google moldy houses, print it out. Here's my house. There's no way. So we just got to take them for the word on a housing application that they're telling the truth, because we do put a clause in the eviction that if you lied on the housing application, we can evict you without notice. So we do that affordability. We look at household size. How many people under the age of 18? And then we look at how many in your, sorry. How many are band members? What are we here for? We're here to house our band members. So as many members in your household are band members, you get points. I also give points to single parents because I think that's extra hardship. A lot of bands will accept that. And then we look at how long you've been on the housing waiting list. I lived on my reserve. I always hear that, you know, this girl just moved home. I've been here 10 years and you gave her a house. So that's a comment. I hear that a lot. So what we do on the scoring is we give you points for how long you've been on the waiting list. We'll give you extra points. Yeah, you have a question?
Which children are
Yeah. For a housing application? We would consider that, and they can sign as legal guardian, so you can consider, as long as they're band members.
So would you put the housing in the children's name or in the non?
You would put in the children's name, but he would be signed as legal guardian of the children. I'm gonna get into that too in marital breakup. That happens a lot. Not marital breakup, so we'll talk about that. Again, rental, we're gonna get into fires, abandoned units. We look at scoring criteria. Abandoned units, usually 30 days if they haven't been abandoned. Northern Ontario, in the winter, very easy to tell no one's home, right? 6 feet of snow, right? On the driveway, they're either dead or they're gone. So it's very important though that you go in there. You know why? What happens to a house in Northern Ontario in January if the hydro goes out? Yeah, you got to go in there. So sometimes I put a clause that the bank can go in there in the winter from November to May with little as 24 hours notice if they think it's abandoned, because they have to protect the asset. You know, once it gets minus 40 out, you know, there's no heat in that house. It's good. The pipes are going to freeze. So you got to make sure. Again, notice provided, we got to confirm residency. I always tell band housing, Facebook them, text them, you know, whatever. Tape the notice on their door, take a picture, register. You got to show that you went out of your way to contact them. If you don't hear from them in 15 days, you can consider it abandoned and you reallocate the house. Okay. Fires, this is something that I've just recently put on because a lot of my bands, we talk about accidental fires covered by the band. But what do we do if it's willful negligence of the tenant? So we look at that. Some of them say maybe wait 5 years. Some of them say they have to pay the deductible. But paying the deductible, some bands, the deductible are 10, 15,000. So how do we, should there be a consequence for people smoking in bed, barbecuing in the house? You know, it's willful damage. So this is always a struggle with First Nations. How do we handle this type of, and what's the consequence? What should it be, right? We talk about that. So when we go to chief and council, a lot of times this is highlighted in yellow, 9 times out of 10, because we can't decide what kind of consequence there should be for this type of thing. But we believe there should be consequence. Now, a lot of them are just saying case by case, you know, if he just burnt down the kitchen, okay. But if he burned down the whole house, that's a whole new ballgame, right? So you want to make sure, because fires in some of the communities happen quite a bit now. So they want to disclose it. Yeah, go ahead. Yep. 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 Yes. Yes. Yep. Yep. Yeah, well, this is where you got, yeah. Yep. Yes. Willful damage? Yes. Yep. Yeah, that is considered willful damage, even though it's a minor thing. We can still consider it. Yes. Yes, you could do that, or eviction if you do it. Usually you get 3 notices in a year that you're out. But yeah, even minor stuff, like I said, even hanging blankets, because they don't know they're causing damage, but once you tell them you're causing damage and they continue to hang that blanket, I know you guys all laugh, but it is, then they're causing willful damage, negligence. So that's why you could write them up on not hanging blankets, taking off those. Like I always tell the bands, just talk to them first verbally. I don't like issuing notice, but just tell them, you're causing damage. If you continue, we're going to give you notice 1. And if you get 3 notices in a year, you're evicted. So, even though it's a small thing, the smoke alarm, it's a major safety issue component. Yeah. Somebody else had a question? Yep.
Okay, so in the policy, why couldn't you just put tenant damage exceeding $1 amount would be
Oh,
automatic
yeah.
eviction?
Okay. Yeah, you could do that, but there's another. Oh, sorry. Marital. Okay, marital breakdown. I'm just going to go into evictions here. So I coined a new term. This one, extraordinary willful damage. There's willful damage, where you cause damage. You know what extraordinary? It's an accounting term. Extraordinary means something out of the ordinary. This is where the tenant completely destroys the house. There is no notice. And I always tell the band to put a dollar amount in there. So that could be like 8,000, 10,000. So if you cause $10,000 per instance, we can evict you without notice. You're gone the next day. This happened to one of the communities. The band manager left on a Friday. The windows and doors were intact at the 4 unit at the end. He came in Monday morning. The guy busted his windows, kicked down his doors, totally destroyed the unit. He looked in the policy, which I designed for him, and all we could do was give him notice number 1. So this is where we kind of coined that term. This is where you completely destroyed the house. So the other thing I want to talk about quickly was marital breakup on a rental and rental own. The difference between rental and rental own, there's only 3 differences. Marital breakup, death of a tenant, and what happens to the unit when the mortgage is paid off. Under a rental own, the marital breakup, a non-band member can sign for band member children as legal guardian, but only the children can exercise that right to do rent to own. Okay. Under a rental for death of a tenant cannot will the house. They do not own it, but we'll go to next of kin. We have some rules. We'll follow next of kin and stuff like that. Under rent to own, we will honor a will as long as it's a band member. It's going to a bond member. So a rent to own, we will honor a will. Under a rental, the beneficiary, if we go next of kin, we normally don't give them the arrears. If the original tenant left the arrears, we don't give it to the family members because usually we have to go after the estate. And a lot of you guys know on estate, there's nothing left on the estate when they file an estate on reserve. But under rent to own, the beneficiary has to take over the rental arrears. You know why? Those rental payments were part of that purchase price to own that house. So the beneficiary has to agree to take over those rental arrears on rental. And then the other thing too, under transfer unit at the end of the mortgage, provided the band members paid all the payments, we transfer the house to them, and they can no longer call the band office. If your window breaks or door, that's your responsibility. Under rental, nothing happens. Stays as a band rental because that's what it's meant to be. Okay. And the other thing we put in there is home ownership options, Section 10 ministerial guarantee, First Nation market housing. Some people have band revolving. You guys know what band revolving loans are? That's where the band is the lender. They have own source revenue. And then we look at other programs, maybe BC housing, anything like that we would include in the housing policy. So again, I just put some, I'm going to leave this presentation here. If you guys want copies, we'll try to get you printed out copies. But again, these are just suggestions that I put in housing policies. Some of them may work in your community, some of them may not. For example, northern communities, they don't do evictions. I have some bands that don't collect rent. So you know what we're calling it? Maintenance fee. It's still $400, but we're not going to call it rent. So we call it maintenance fee. That sounds a little bit more sellable to clients, tenants, that you're not paying rent, you're going to be paying maintenance so that we can take care of your house. And the other thing too is when we introduce a housing policy, we try to get tenants on board. So when you do a housing policy, make sure It's a small group. I usually get one member, chief of council, one member from the housing committee, and the band staff. I like to work with a small group to get the first draft done. Then we go to the housing committee and chief of council. So you got to get that buy-in. And then the other thing, and it could get rowdy, is you got to do community presentations. And that's where it gets a little, I've been to some very animated meetings on housing, you know, and it's usually because people are talking about, so I've learned through the years in my opening remarks that, you know what, I can't fix what happened to you 10 years ago or 12 years ago. You know, that I wasn't here, we didn't have a housing policy, but we can fix what's going forward with this new housing policy. So we kind of tell them why we're doing annual inspections. We're trying to fix these minor repairs before they turn into major repairs. And we want to make the housing safe and affordable, right? And then there's the overcrowding. And then the biggest challenge I'm having the last couple of years is addictions, opioids. You know, we are putting stuff in the housing policy now. We're putting what I call circuit breakers in the default management. If a tenant agrees to seek counseling, if it's mental or drug related, well, addictions, then we will suspend eviction process, but you got to get counseling. And a lot of communities have health teams now, community health wellness teams. So housing works with people on welfare, the health department to help these tenants. So you got to, you know what, I was really beaten up in Quebec by a band counselor who worked in social services. He said, Scott, would you kick out somebody because they're in a wheelchair? No. Well, why are you kicking out people with addictions? That's a sickness. It's not their fault. So that's why a lot of times we're putting these circuit breakers in there because they are destroying houses, but it's just because of their state of mind. And a lot of bands are struggling about what to do with people. I actually have one housing policy where they ask the tenant before he moves in, do you need help? Because we will help you. We're not going to disqualify you from housing. If you qualify, you'll get in, but you got to tell us if you need mental or addiction help, and we'll help you. Yep.
We have a complex case team, which is our housing department, and we get together with our health department every month. We meet about people with complex issues, so like addiction and stuff like that. And we look into like holistic healing and wraparound care. Equity versus equality. Sometimes you have to meet people where they are.
Yep.
People have different barriers, thicker barriers than some people do. So we do biannual inspections for these people instead of just the annual.
Yep.
So we check in on them twice a year, sometimes even more if they need it. But some people just need a little bit more help, a little bit more attention.
Yeah, and I do have one housing manager that does weekly visits with the ones that are in addictions. They go in the house every week, make sure it's cleaned up, that person hasn't fall off the wagon, and they've been doing that for 6 months. So, you know, some housing managers will go the extra mile. It's up to you guys really how you want to help your band members. But yeah, this is a sickness, and you know, kicking people out for addictions is a struggle with a lot of communities because they are destroying the houses. They are destroying the houses and they're turning them into, you know, party places. You don't want to see that with housing, especially when you got a housing list that, you know, there's 50 people and this house is being destroyed. So it's really hard. So it's a little bit different. So I'm out of time, but I'll leave the presentation here with the organizers and then we'll hopefully they'll distribute it. Yeah. Yeah.
It's just one question, and I guess this is the big question. And when you implement a housing policy, and if, like you said, this person, whatever they're trying to, if they're damaging the home and so forth, and you give them the warnings and so forth,
Yep.
and it comes time for eviction. Now, in my community, we already have a housing shortage.
Yep.
And people are living together, you know, in that one unit. But if we kick that one person out and we kick those people out, where are they going to live?
Yes,
especially
exactly.
on a First Nation, right?
Yeah.
Like, so it becomes the responsibility of the chief of council if they enforce that and they kick a family because the mother or the father is using drugs or they're selling drugs, and then they need to be evicted out of that unit. In an urban setting, like a town or a city would have the grounds to do
Yes.
that. They you know, they get the OPP or whatever there, and they can evict the people out. On a First Nation level, it's very, you know, if I go kick somebody out over there, you'll get the half of the members which
Yeah.
are related to that person.
Exactly.
On your knocking on your window, damaging your windows in
Slashing
your car,
tires.
because they're pissed off that you kicked that person out, and that's their
Yes.
relative. And I guess there's a sensitivity that I would stress when it comes to developing policy,
Yes.
because they can't afford to go living somewhere else if
No.
they're, you know, if they're under welfare, for instance.
Yes.
So how do you deal with that?
Yeah, that's a tough one because one of the things I always tell First Nations, you know, the first thing you talked about where they come after you, I always tell them you got to have a policy on lateral violence. Not violence against banned employees, not acceptable. You know, yelling, screaming, physical, should have that as part of your policy. But dealing with opioid, it's tough because a lot of bands, again, it's the whole political issue about how do we treat these people? You know, it's not their fault they're not being able to meet the responsibilities, but it's trying also at the same time meet the needs of the community. So a lot of councils will actually do evict or they get another family member to move in. I've seen that where they get other family members to move in, so that person starts to settle down and hopefully gets their life. And you're right, like I said, I work in a lot of northern communities. You evict somebody, you're just creating a problem down the road because they're gonna go live with Auntie Joe and she's already got 15 people. Now there's gonna be 21 people in the house. So you're causing another. So that's why I was telling you in my opening remarks, evictions and some reserves I work, they don't do it because they're just gonna create another problem. So thank you. One of the things I wanted you to learn today was, you know, it's okay if someone hangs a Toronto Maple Leaf blanket, but you know, Montreal Canadian, you know, get that guy out of there. So, thank you.
The reason is that the goalies are just as big a sieve as the blanket.
They let the air in. And the pucks. So
All
thank
right,
you.
we apologize. We ran out of time. We're running over a bit, actually. So thanks to Scott. I have a gift for you on behalf of the planning committee and the conference.
Thank you.
Thanks for sharing. So the presentations will be available on the website eventually. So if you're looking for a copy of it, it'll be available in the coming days as well. Our next session is actually plenary back in the main ballroom. So please head over that way. There'll be success stories from community housing projects.
So
Thank you
there's
so much.
my contact information there. So thanks.
That's really popular.
What's that?
It's a really popular subject.
I know. I keep telling you guys 45 minutes.
No, it's not. You know what? It's trying to just chop it up, right? We've given
Gotta give me an hour and a half.
no, we've given people, you know, part one, part two kind of thing. That's what really we should be doing.
My name is Sheila Caesar.
Okay.
And I really enjoyed the presentation. You gave me a lot of insight because we deal with a lot of